program is brought to you by Newsworks in cooperation with the Eau Claire Area School Board. This program is simulcast on WRFP-LP 101.9 FM.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order this regular meeting of the Eau Claire School Board. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you to everyone who's here tonight and here watching live. Tonight's meeting will be broadcast on Valley Media Works, Charter Channel 994, also on the radio, WRFP LP 101.9 FM, and online at valleymediaworks.org and ecasd.us. Secretary Iverson, are we in compliance with open meetings law notification?
Yes, we are.
Okay, could we have a roll call, please, for verification of quorum?
Commissioner Bika?
Here.
Commissioner Hambuck-Boyle?
Here.
Commissioner Harder? Commissioner Klinkhammer? Here. Commissioner Luganbill?
Here.
Commissioner Torres?
Here.
Commissioner Boo?
Here. That brings us to our public forum section of the evening, where you'll have up to 3 minutes to address the board, actually up to 4 minutes to address the board regarding any issue that's on your mind. But we will not hear personal complaints of school personnel nor any person connected with the school system. So do we have anyone signed up for public forum?
Yes, Sarah Lilly.
Okay, if you want to just come up to the microphone and state your name and address.
Hello, my name is Sarah Lilly. I live at 2716 Eisenhower Street, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, 54701. I just wanted to share something. I wrote it down so I would remember it, so forgive me. Hello, I'm Sarah Lilly. I am currently the Library Media Specialist at Robbins Elementary, and I've worked in the Eau Claire Area School District since 2003. Prior to that, I was a Media Specialist in Minnesota, but my husband and I decided to move back to Wisconsin to be closer to family, and we knew that Eau Claire had a great reputation. I love my job. I love what I do. I love my students at Robbins. I get to share new books with them. I get to read picture books with kindergartners. I get to help older children learn how to use their iPads. We're starting a 5th grade news program this year, which is pretty exciting, the Robbins Report. It's a weekly report of happenings, and they're very excited. The 5th graders are especially very excited. We're also hosting 2 author presentations in October, one for 1st grade and one for 5th grade, and our PTO is allowing this, paying for this to happen. It's part of the Chippewa Valley Book Festival. So we have a lot of wonderful things happening at Robbins. It's a wonderful school to work in, and I think the Eau Claire Area School District is a wonderful district to work in. My daughter attends Manns Elementary, which is another amazing school, and my husband teaches 2nd grade there. And I know he loves working at Manns and getting to go to school with his daughter there, our daughter, I should say. We're really proud to be teachers in the Eau Claire Area School District, and we love what we do. However, we're both very concerned about the possible changes to OPEB and hope that the board will please keep OPEB as is and allow us to keep our promise that we were hired with. So, thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else signed up for the public forum this evening? No. Okay. That brings us to the next section of our agenda, which is the review of board calendar of events. Dr. Hardebeck?
So the superintendent's report will be very brief tonight to save time for our work session. I do want to remind you of several events that are coming up in the next few weeks. The first one being on September 27th, which is a workshop presentation and regional meeting for the WASB. And that will begin at 4:30 at Florian Gardens. October 2nd, there are 2 committee meetings. One is the Budget Development meeting, and that will be at 1 o'clock. And the other is the Family Advisory Council meeting, and that will be at 7 p.m., and those are in the Administration Building. On October 8th, we have a meeting of the Policy and Governance Committee and our regular school board meeting. The Policy and Governance meeting will take place at 8:45 a.m., and the school board meeting will begin at 5:30 with a closed session with the 7 p.m. regular meeting. On October 9th, there's a meeting of the LEAP Committee. That will be at 4 p.m. in the Administration Building. On October 18th, there's a meeting of Demographic Trends and Facility Planning Council. That is at 4:30 in the Administration Building. On October 22nd, there's another meeting of the Policy and Governance Committee meeting, followed by a school board meeting with the Policy and Governance meeting at 8:45 a.m. and the school board meeting at 7 p.m. That's my report for tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Hardebeck. That brings us now to our consent resolution agenda. It's a very light business meeting tonight, so we have plenty of time for our work session as a board. So I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes of September 10th, 2018, the minutes of closed session September 10th, 2018, the Human Resources and Employment Report, the 2017-18 budget adjustments, gifts in the amount of $15,026.40 for the period of August 1, 2018 through August 31, 2018, payment of all bills in the amount of $7,100,987.54, and net payroll in the amount of $5,132,935.96 for the period of August 1 through August 31, 2018, and adoption of new policy 453.7, student mental health and wellness education. So I would entertain a motion to approve 4.2 through 4.8.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, and if we could do a roll call vote for this?
Commissioner Bika?
Yes.
Commissioner Hambuck-Boyle?
Yes.
Commissioner Harder?
Yes.
Commissioner Klinkhammer?
Yes.
Commissioner Luganbill?
Yes.
Commissioner Torres?
Yes.
And Commissioner Vu.
Yes.
Okay, now we get to adjourn to our work session. We have here, you'll have a agenda that lists our time that this work session is from. So we're going to be done at 9 o'clock p.m. Even if we're still talking, we're going to adjourn it at 9, I promise. But we have three parts of our agenda tonight. One is a board responsibilities overview, one is a discussion of board governance, and one is a review of policy 185. So I think this should be a very helpful work session, and hopefully we'll be able to come out of it with some specific next steps as a board on each of them. But first, for the board responsibilities overview, I'd like to turn things over to our board attorney, Attorney Kirk Strang, who came here all the way from Milwaukee today. Madison today. And take it away.
All right.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's good to be back. I think everybody on the board knows I'm an Eau Claire Memorial graduate, so it's always good to be back in Eau Claire where the sun is always shining. So we're going to talk. Pardon me? Thank you. We're going to be talking a little bit, first of all, about the legal authority of a school board. So we'll start there. For those of you following along, I'm on page 1. And the first two provisions having to do with the duties and powers of school boards and how we look at state law, frankly, that's changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years. There was a time when a school board was frankly more constrained by state law, and the way the law worked was a school board had what we called only the authority to act according to specific statutes that give them the authority to act, or what we called authorities that arise by necessary implication. That was it. That's what a school board could do. If it wasn't written down in state statutes and it didn't arise by necessary implication between the lines, a school board didn't have the power to do it. That changed a lot over the past few legislative sessions, and now we have enabling legislation that states that the construction of our statutes is to construe the authority of school boards far more broadly, so that school boards have more authority to do that which is necessary to further the cause of education in this state. So it's important to treat that as a touchstone for our discussion, because we've changed the way we look at school boards, really, in the last 15 years. There are notations in your outline materials about school board duties and school board powers. I won't recite all of them because there are so many, but I will tell you a few things about them that I think are important to take away from a working session like this. First of all, for all of the sometimes questionable and sometimes poor organization that state statutes have, and problems with readability that certainly some state statutes have. Sometimes you look at some of these things and you say, now here's a sentence that only a lawyer can love, and our English faculty is pulling their hair out in the process. But one thing that actually works pretty well is the statutory authority regarding school board duties and school board powers. When you look at those statutes, specifically 120.12 and 120.13, it's a great working list of what the duties of a school board are and what the powers of a school board are. And if you do nothing else as a school board when you crack open that statute book, look at those two. They're really informative, and it's frankly pretty well organized to teach everybody as they go through it what the duties and powers of school boards are. One other thing that I would mention about that is note the school board duties with particularity, because legally we don't look at powers and duties quite the same way when we consider state law in the context of other statutes that we also have to account for. School boards may have the authority to do something under school board powers, but of course your lawyers are immediately going to be looking in other places to see where those authorities are limited or constrained by something else. School board duties are a little different. When you look at school board duties, you can walk away from that assured that somehow, some way, it's the obligation of the school district board to accomplish that. So when you look at school board powers and duties, don't think of them as kind of an omnibus list that you can simply fuse together and say this is all stuff that we do as a board. Think of them as discrete lists that really have very different meanings, and that the duties of the school board are paramount because you want to be able to say that you're satisfying those duties when you perform your duties as board. For those of you following along, I'm going to skip forward a little bit to the primary responsibilities of the school board, which appears beginning on page 3 of the materials that I distributed. One of the most important functions of any school board, of course, is to establish the mission of a school board. And the mission statement of boards, of course, varies greatly when you look at school board statements across the state. Board Policy 110 is your policy articulating the mission of the school board, so I included it in these materials for your review. The mission of the district being to educate our children in partnership with the family and the community to live responsible, creative, and fulfilling lives in a rapidly changing world. That's a very important thing for a school board to do, to state what its mission is and what is going to be primary in the board's performance of its duties. A second area is policy making. This board has a number of policies on policy making, Board Policy 151, 151.1, and there's an extensive administrative rule, 151, all dedicated to the business of policy making. I won't go into all of the details on policy committees. I'll be getting to that a little bit later in our discussion. But one thing I want to mention about policy making now that I think is important, and that is always remember you're going to have at least 2 or 3 different categories of policy that you have to consider, and they're going to be, frankly, things that you agree on universally at the start, and then frankly you may have disagreements as you go down the continuum to discretionary policies. The first, of course, is mandatory policies. We have any number of statutes where the statute says you have to have a policy on this. Those, of course, present an easy case to discuss, because if you're required by law to have a policy, that pretty much ends the discussion. You're going to have it, and you're going to have, in some cases, content that is also dictated by statute. An example, of course, is you have to have a policy on bullying. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There has to be a policy. It doesn't have to conform entirely to DPI's model policy, but you do have to have one. And so that's an example of a mandated policy. There are other policies, frankly, that you'll have in order to accomplish any number of objectives. Ethics, uniformity, very important for a member of the faculty at one school to have confidence that the way things are being run, at least in certain respects, is comparable to the way they're being run in other buildings. And so you want to have some policies that provide uniformity in places where uniformity is appropriate. Then we get into policies that frankly represent the policy view of the board on outcomes. Those are probably the most difficult policies to articulate, to formulate, and ultimately implement. The reason for that, of course, is you're not being mandated to have the policy. You're not doing it, for example, to create uniformity. You're doing it because it's the board's expression of what it wants to direct be done in certain areas. In some situations, that represents a declaration that simply is implemented. In other situations, though, it will be a policy that detracts from the discretion of an administrator. You're essentially telling an administrator, this is an area where we don't want you to use judgment. We want you to follow this policy. Obviously, that is a place where there can be great tension in deciding when is it appropriate to limit administration's discretion, when is it appropriate to determine that a policy must be implemented in order to do things a certain way. So it's very hard to make policy in those areas, but that to me is the continuum. When people ask, and they don't always ask, but when they do ask, my philosophy is try to, in the third area, be disciplined about the policies you implement. That isn't to say don't implement policy at all, but always remember what you're dealing with, because there are going to be times when you will have unusual situations arise and you'll say to yourself, we would rather not be imprisoned by our policy, we would rather have some latitude to work with, and unfortunately the way we crafted this, we don't have that latitude any longer. So to me, always have the policies you have to have, certainly have the policies that make sense, but when you get into that area where you're really deciding are we going to dictate certain outcomes, or on the other hand, leave it to discretion of those who manage, think very carefully about the implications of that, and also think carefully about the wording of that if you want to preserve a little bit of both worlds in your policy making. Student achievement. One of the most important things that happens in a board room is determining how to approach curriculum and student achievement. You'll notice that curriculum appears as a school board duty, not a school board power. So school boards have a responsibility to determine curriculum within the framework that the state authorizes. And that is an extremely important area for a school board to make sure to stay on top of in an active way. In fact, I encourage policy committees of the board or other committees that are the right committee that you decide to look actively at curriculum issues. The reason is systemically we usually look at curriculum as not really something that comes from the board to the buildings and to the faculty, but rather we look at it as something that comes from the faculty to the board. So we will usually see department heads and other faculty leaders being the most important people in telling us what's new in education, what should we be looking to do, along with their counterparts in administration. Very important for the board to spend the time listening to those people so that you get the best possible information about what's going on today in a variety of academic subjects, so that our scholarship is in line with our policy direction. One other thing I want to mention before I get into some of the dicier part of this discussion is I think the board sets a tone as an ethical leader. One of the most important features for a school board, you won't find it anywhere in the statutes obviously, but inspiring confidence in constituents requires that the board be perceived as conducting itself ethically and requiring individuals that work for the district to conduct themselves accordingly. Ethics is very, very important to the credibility of school boards. That's not a statutory or a legal remark on my part. That's 30 years of experience as a school lawyer telling me, here's what I see that works. When a school board sends a strong ethical message about things that it will do to ensure that the way we do things is honorable, That's very important for people to see and for people to appreciate. So it's a goal that's worth talking about, because individuals can behave ethically when school boards sit as a collective body. The challenge is to make sure that in the debate, the discussion, in the things we do as board members, that the high ethical standards that individual board members observe translate into a message that the whole board as a community, as a collective body, also holds those ethical standards. Finally, and there's, as you can see, a lot more outline to read than I'm going to cover in the time I have, which is good because I don't want to be cut off at 9 o'clock and sap your other agenda items. So, but impartial tribunal, that is important for a school board to play a role as an impartial tribunal. That can happen in a more colloquial sense in day-to-day operations. The board wants the public and its constituents to understand that it can objectively and neutrally and fairly judge issues that come before it. There are times when this impartial tribunal standard comes up in the context of employee rights, citizen rights, and other situations where there's actually due process implications for impartial tribunal. So you do have to have that, but there's a lot of mythology about what an impartial tribunal is, and if nothing else at this section, I want to take a moment to, I think, debunk that mythology. There are times when people will encourage a school board to believe that it cannot be an impartial tribunal if it knows anything about a matter that is coming before it. So if you know the people, if you know the subject, if you know something about the background behind an issue, some of these people will tell you that compromises your impartiality, that you should literally be in the dark and not know anything about what's coming before you, and if you do, that is somehow fatal to your ability to serve as an impartial tribunal. Do not believe these individuals. It is not true. It's not reflected in our law. That would be evidence of an empty mind and not an open one. You're required to have an open mind to the information that comes before you, to judge it fairly. You're still allowed to know who your neighbors are, who their kids are, and occasionally know people in your own community. You wouldn't be on a school board if you didn't take an active interest in kids and in the community. So it's okay for you to know things. It's okay for you to get briefings. The key is an impartial tribunal has essentially 2 or 3 elements that you have to remember. One, you can't have a financial interest in the outcome of anything that comes before you, what the case law refers to as a pecuniary interest in the outcome. Secondly, at least at one time, we used to say that you can't have a situation where you were a target of personal abuse at the hands of an individual who now appears before you expecting impartiality from you. Now, our courts have frankly dissected that a little bit and whittled it down. We had a case involving a school district several years ago involving an administrator who was subject to non-renewal. And in that case, the administrator's counsel took the position that the school board cannot act as a hearing board under the statute that calls for the board to hold hearings. So you had a statute that says the hearing shall be before the board, and the attorneys for the administrator said, no, that can't happen because this individual has been very active and activist and has thrown a lot of mud at the board as this case has developed, and so these board members have now been targets of personal abuse at the hands of the individual, and for that reason this individual is entitled to an impartial hearing officer as a substitute for the board, even though the statute called for the board to hear the case. Our Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals made very short work of that and essentially said, you must be kidding. So you're telling us that if someone strategically takes aim at school board members and does it roundly enough and thoroughly enough, they can succeed in disqualifying their own employer as a decision maker we're not going to give that any countenance. And so it's still part of the case law we look at, but the fact of the matter is it's been whittled down quite a bit. And then the third standard is actual bias. If you come to a situation where you cannot make a fair decision, where you cannot consider the information being presented or the evidence being presented fairly, because you just have such a bias in favor of an outcome that you can't possibly consider evidence at all, where you just are in that position. That would be a situation where a board member would be wise to recuse themselves. Now, I should say that's an individual board member's discretionary decision. A school board lacks the authority to exclude one of its members from any meeting. So even if a school board member were to say, I know what I want to do, I know what I want to rule, I'm not listening to any of this, something extreme like that that we never see, just to test the principle. If the rest of the school board said, well, we're going to take a vote to exclude you, that vote is unlawful. The way the law works in this area is every school board member is entitled to attend and participate in school board meetings, notwithstanding the reservations of other board members. In other words, individual board members still have the authority to decide whether they're going to break the rules or not. So it's very important to understand this is an area where cajoling and persuading is what the board has to persuade one of its members if they have a bias of the sort I described, and frankly it's pretty hard to find a situation like that, but if they did, it would be the job of the board to try to persuade that individual to think otherwise, because you cannot disqualify that person from participating. Yes, Joe?
So your part here about personal embroilment, which could result in a claim of a due process violation. So personal embroilment, what do you have to do to reach that level? I mean, what are we looking, I mean, because I'm thinking, for example, if there is the potential of an employee matter to come before the board,
Right.
or a grievance or whatever, and a board member meets with somebody, or a board member, talks with someone on the phone for extended periods and does that kind of thing, does that reach the level of personal embroilment?
Yeah, it can, and let me try to articulate some of the parameters of that. School board members get phone calls from people, and obviously just the fact that a school board member got a call and gave a sensitive ear to something that someone was telling them, that all by itself is not going to mean that a school board member necessarily has acquired a bias that's going to disqualify them, or more exactly, create a situation where they should consider disqualifying themselves. On the other hand, a situation where a school board member declares openly that they already know what they want to do, like the example I gave, or, for example, where a school board member is actively involved in the case that's being presented. So, for example, if you are a school board member who happens to be part of the dispute that we're talking about, that you've been involved actively in it, that you've participated in advocacy on behalf of an individual. Those are situations where we get closer to the line, and in some cases we may step over it. So we just have to weigh in some of these situations differences of degree as well as differences of kind. Turning to the ethical obligations of school board members that go beyond morality and getting into really the ethics as the law defines it, we start with, first of all, one of the most important parts of our state ethics law, and that is the definition section that appears at 1942 of state statutes. That statute describes anything of value, and that's very important because board members are precluded from accepting anything of value from any number of sources, typically sources who hope to influence board member voting. Anything of value means money, property, favor, service, payment, advance, even forbearance, so consideration of some sort. All of that can be something of value in certain circumstances, and certainly money is the most common thing of value that we see in ethics violations. When we look at how our ethics board has defined the law over the years, Pretty much after a cup of coffee, you're already getting into areas of substantial value. And based on the price of the cup of coffee I had this morning, that might even cross the line. Because it's not 25 cents anymore to get a cup of coffee, right? So we have to bear in mind that anything of value has a very strict and very demanding standard. And so we're precluded from accepting anything of value, and as I say, you get too much past a cup of coffee, and you're starting to already enter the zone that is problematic in this area. One other thing to bear in mind is the term immediate family gets used in our ethics statute. Immediate family, of course, means an individual's spouse, but it also means somebody who is financially dependent on an individual. So somebody who's a relative by marriage, lineal descent, or adoption who receives either directly or indirectly more than half of his or her support from an individual, that is treated as an immediate family member for purposes of the statute. So that's important to remember, because when we have situations where arguments are being made about a board member's spouse securing something of value, it also applies to the board member's child, who perhaps still lives at home and depends on the board member financially for their sustenance. So we do have a somewhat broader definition to immediate family than sometimes would seem to be common sense. The other thing to remember in this area is, what is a local public office? This is a touchstone for any number of legal issues that will affect a school board. Clearly, school board members are local public office holders, and clearly your superintendent, your executive team, those are local public office holders. But when you go through the definition of a local public office holder in state law, you see it's not just elective people, but it's also appointed positions that serve for a specified term, which means people with 2-year contracts are likely to be covered, people who serve at the pleasure of the appointing authority. All of those individuals are local public office holders as well. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because, first of all, local public office holders are the people who are the primary subject of our ethics law. Secondly, it matters because when public records requests are made, local public office holders are treated very differently under the law than employees, even though those local public office holders may themselves be employees. So when we have a local public office holder and requests are made for records about that local public office holder, their rights with respect to that request are really quite different. An employee has specific statutory authority in certain circumstances to go into court and to try to prevent disclosure of the materials that have been requested, while a local public office holder in all likelihood simply has 5 days to augment the records with their side of the story before they're released. Now, it's a more complicated subject than that, but it shows you the stark difference that the law makes between local public office holders and those who don't meet that definition, who are also employed by the district. The other thing that is important to note is this matters because it influences how you put up notices, for example. We're required by law to identify our local public office holders for the public. You don't have to do that by name, but you do have to do it by position. And so when we look at required notices we give to the public and certain other things that we communicate to the public, we always have to have a handle on who our local public office holders are. And in many circumstances, we have to actually disclose that. So it will influence things that we put up on the wall as well as how we administer our code of ethics. Speaking of which, turning our attention to the code of ethics for local public officials. There are a series of prohibitions here, but what it boils down to is public officials can't use their positions to acquire things of value, and people who want to persuade public officials to do things that they want can't use things of value as an inducement to persuade them to do so. And there are a series of penalties that are enforced if the code of ethics is breached. So remember again, the standard is anything of substantial value will meet the test, and in any circumstance where the gift or gratuity is extended to someone who is voting on a matter in which somebody has an interest, that will clearly indicate that there's been a violation of the law. And I think it goes further than that in the sense that I think a local public office holder, when we consider the full web of the statute, really is precluded from accepting gratuities, except those that are incidental to providing the service. So for example, if you are attending a luncheon in the community, you don't have to refuse to have a plate put in front of you to participate in that event. But there are going to be situations where, on the other hand, if somebody who has a paving contract before the board invites you out to dinner, that would be an example of something, of course, that we all know we cannot do. So that's our code of ethics for local public officials. There are forfeitures that associate with that. They are up to $1,000 and they have to be personally paid. There's no indemnity for a public official. There are a few statutes that I'll just gloss over but mention because they're important. Obviously, bribery of public officers and employees is a felony in Wisconsin. I've outlined for you the text of that statute. Misconduct in public office, same thing. That's also a crime in Wisconsin and constitutes a felony. One of the things to be dialed into that I'll spend a little more time on is private interests in public contracts. That's where an individual on a school board has a private interest in a contract that may come before the board. Obviously, the action that somebody takes in order to approve something that they themselves have a financial interest in is what this statute is going for. So my example of the paving contract from a few minutes ago would be an example of that. If somebody were actually the head of the paving company and they sat on the school board, taking action to see to it that that contract were secured by their company would be an example of a violation, provided that you exceed the $15,000 threshold. The statute requires that the value of the contract be $15,000 or more. So think about it this way. It's always a violation of the code of ethics if it's less than $15,000 but more than a cup of coffee. It's a violation of the private interest in public contract if it's $15,000 or more. The difference is substantial. Obviously, one is a felony and the other is a forfeiture, but both are penalized and both, of course, violate our law. Final thing is incompatibility of offices. That has to do with an individual having an office and also another office that is incompatible with the first. So, for example, you can't be employed by the school district while you sit on the school board. The only exception that's been made to that, and it was made quite recently, was for the benefit of school districts that were having trouble hiring coaches and advisors for co-curricular activities. Our legislature loosened it up just a little and said that we will allow board members to serve as volunteer coaches. And that's the only exception that they've made. And that was only on a voluntary basis, not a paid basis. So the idea, of course, is that school board members, when we apply the incompatibility of offices doctrine to school board members can't sit in a position where they are effectively both the boss of and supervised by the same individuals. So, for example, if you were a coach that's being paid to be a coach, the supervisor might be that building principal, and yet you as a board member supervise that person. That is what the incompatibility of offices doctrine is trying to prevent, a situation where a board member wears multiple hats and the two are not compatible with one another. You've got a couple of policies that I'll mention before bringing it to a close because I have 5 minutes and we're in the speed round at this point. Board Policy 153 is the conflict of interest statute. You have defined conflicts of interest for purposes of your board policy in a way that's far more broad than appears in state law. So one of the things to remember as board members is the board has made a policy commitment to a much broader set of circumstances qualifying as conflicts of interest. So if you look at that particular policy, you'll notice there are things like board members cannot participate in decision-making that substantially affects a matter in which the board member, employee members of the household or immediate family of the board member have a financial interest. That sounds a little like what we were talking about before. No board member shall accept any gift or favors of value that could influence decision-making. Again, something that sounds like we were talking about before. But we also have some things that relate to ethics here in the most proper and raw sense of ethics. No board member or employee shall use confidential district information for personal gain or for the gain of others. Information really isn't covered, at least not squarely, by some of the statutes we were talking about. But as school board members, you learn a great deal, and some of the things you learn are confidential. There are any number of people who will have an interest in acquiring that confidential information, and so when that information is used as currency, this policy prevents that and says that's not okay. Board Policy 165 is the board's code of conduct, and again, the board has done more than the law does in this area by articulating 14 separate standards for board member conduct. They range from an obligation to keep abreast of current district, state, and national education issues, devoting enough time and thought to studying the issues that come before the board, preparing for board meetings, using respectful tone, and so on. There are any number of things that you as a board have decided these are important to us and important enough that we're going to regulate ourselves by applying these standards to ourselves as a body and as individuals. Turning to a couple of other things that I want to mention before getting to the end of our time related to public records and open meetings law. One of the things that we know about technology use is that back in the old days, we used to have a concern for walking quorums of school boards violating the open meetings law. And before we had email and before we could text one another, that literally happened as a walking quorum. Two board members would get together and talk about something, and then they'd say, well, why don't you go ask John Doe what he thinks, and let's see if he's with us. One of them goes and talks to John Doe goes and talks to someone else, and before you know it, we've got something like the old telephone game we played as children, but it's organizing votes in an almost congressional fashion. That violates the open meeting law because that is a walking quorum. Nowadays, a walking quorum is far more easy to have purposefully and by accident because everyone has email, and through the medium of email, when emails are exchanged, we always have to be very careful of what we send to one another, because if we don't have a clear line of communication that is not meant to start a discussion or further decision making, you can run into a walking quorum fairly quickly. And in fact, our Attorney General had a case a couple of years ago involving the UW Board of Regents. And there you have a number of people sitting on the Board of Regents who are from different places in Wisconsin, and you guessed it, emails would go back and forth about things that they were going to meet on. Well, the Attorney General said this is still a public body. It's covered by the open meeting law. You can't, through email, be going through a dialogue that ultimately is part of your decision-making process. And that's a very important thing that I should mention, because there's at least in some quarters, a myth out there about this that also should be debunked. It doesn't have to be an action item to be something that qualifies as a discussion that we need to make sure to notice under the open meetings law. So sometimes people say, we were just talking. This isn't something that's an action item for the board, and therefore the conversation and the series of conversations should be okay, right? Not at all. the public is entitled to watch you debate, to have dialogue, as well as vote on action items. And so that means under the open meetings law, we're not just saying you can't have action taking place in other forums. You have to remember that just the discussion, the debate, the dialogue that you have is something that the open meetings law is meant to protect the public's right to know. So it's very important to bear in mind there's no special status that action items have in that regard. And I think there's sometimes, I've even had the question many times where people say, well, we don't have to notice that because that's not an action item, right? And of course the answer is, of course we do. If we're going to talk about it, it has to be noticed and on our agenda. Another thing related to this same subject is private devices do not change the nature of a record. So if you're a school board member and you have a private email address, it's possible that some things that happen at that email address are matters of public record. So for example, if you're a school board member and you're a parent, and another parent in your neighborhood says, are you bringing cookies to the bake sale? I would say that's a private communication because you're being addressed as a parent and not in your capacity as a board member. But if that same person writes to you at that same private email address and says, what are you going to do about our bus route? We have a bus route where the time the driver arrives varies 20-25 minutes, and I don't know when I can leave for work because there's no reliability to when this particular bus arrives. Now you're being addressed as a board member, and even though it's on your own email, on your own computer in your home, at your own address, it's a public record, and in fact arrangements have to be made to catalog that under our record retention policy. One thing before closing that I just want to mention about the authority to convene in closed session. You have done that well, and you've done that correctly, and so you're doing a good job of getting the notice and reading through it in its entirety and voting on going into closed appropriately. But there are a couple of things to remember about closed session that I think are instructive, and then I'll close if there are no questions. I'll close for good. First of all, there is some thinking out there that it is not permitted to vote in closed session. That is not true. If a matter is properly discussed in closed session, it can be voted on in closed session unless a state statute requires that it be voted on in open. Now, I tend to encourage boards to vote on matters in open session whenever it's possible to do so, when doing so doesn't compromise the purpose of the closed session that preceded the vote. But if you have a truly proper notice for a closed session and you are properly discussing that subject in closed session, unless a state statute says you have to vote on that in open session, you're entitled in most cases to vote on it in closed session. And there is some thinking still out there that you can't vote in closed session, and that is not true. The issue is, are you properly noticed for closed? Are you following that notice when you are in closed? And is it something that state law permits you by not prohibiting you from voting on in closed? So it's important to know when you structure your closed session agenda. A second thing to remember about closed session agendas is in our state statutes we have a series of subsections that I've put in the outline materials for you that identify some of the most common reasons for being in closed session. Those are things that have to be articulated as part of a closed session notice. You have to get the statute number and letter correctly for a closed session notice. But there's some language that appears in each of these. So you'll have the statutory subsection, and then you have some language there that says what the justification for closed session is. If all that you do is list the language that appears in the statute, that notice is deficient. In fact, you don't even have to pay attention to the language. You've got to get the numbers and letters right. But after that, you need your own description of why you're going to close session. And the test that I think the Attorney General follows and that I encourage you to use is, if I'm an individual that is a member of your public, and I look at one of your notices, when I look at that notice, can I reasonably understand why it is you're going into closed session? If all that you do is recite the statutory language to me, I haven't the faintest idea why you're going into closed session. So you have to at least alert members of the public as to the reason you're going into closed session with the way you write the notice. So the numbers and letters matter, and your individualized description matters. The language that appears in the statute, some people like to include that in the notice as well. You can do it, but it doesn't carry you any further. You still have to have an individualized description that describes the closed session content. One thing about that, too, is people will say, well, then, doesn't that undermine the purpose of a closed session? Not really. There's a continuum here. On the one hand, if you say, as a boilerplate is always a bad idea in this area. So if you have kind of a stock notice that says going into closed pursuant to 1985 1C to discuss employment and personnel, not good enough. A notice that says going into closed session to discuss the possible non-renewal of a member of the district faculty, probably about right. Going into closed session under 1985 1C to discuss the non-renewal of Jane Doe, probably saying too much. Okay, so there's that happy medium where you're making sure to articulate why you're going into closed, but without giving up information that really somebody's confidentiality rights are put at stake. One final thought with respect to closed session, and that, of course, is as an ethical matter, I think your board encourages its own members through policy to respect the confidentiality of closed session. I want to emphasize that as much as possible. When you get information in closed session for a variety of reasons, that information has to be held in confidence. And if a decision is going to be made to breach that confidentiality, that has to be a decision made carefully and by the board as a collective body. Individual board members lack the authority to trump the board's decision-making about going into closed. And this is probably at its worst when the individual who breaches that confidentiality also voted for the closed session. Because when an individual votes to go into closed, they're making a representation to their fellow board members that they agree that closed session is appropriate. In fact, that's the reason we take a roll call vote, is so individual board members have the ability to say, I vote against the closed session, but I can still participate in it after the vote is taken. So be very, very careful about confidentiality. It's one of the most important things to remember, and not to trump the board's collective decision to do things in the confidentiality of closed session. And that, frankly, is a theme that I guess I can add to the end, since I'm with the introductions. Maybe I'm still in my 45, I don't know. But one other thing that I think is important to impart, and that is, boards act as collective bodies. That's what they are. Generally speaking, individual board members are private citizens until they sit down as part of a committee or as part of the board. They don't have the authority of the board as individuals. They're just board members until you meet like you're doing right now. And even then, they only have the authority of one voting member of a collective. That's important to remember at almost every turn, from an ethical standpoint and from a legal standpoint. I have a story that I sometimes tell, and it's old enough that I can, and it was public enough that I can tell it. But I had a case once where an individual was elected to a school board, and we had the fourth Monday organizational meeting, and right after the fourth Monday is the fourth Tuesday. And on Tuesday morning at about 9:30, I got a call from the high school principal. And the high school principal was whispering. And he said, "Kirk, is that you?" And I'm like, "Yes." And he said, "You're not going to believe this, but fill in the name of new board member, is here. I'm like, okay. And he said, well, he's out in the outer office with a clipboard taking notes on how the people who work in the outer office are working. Quite literally, he was standing over people who were at their desks and computer screens taking notes on what they're doing. And his question for me was, what do I do about this? And of course I said, well, first of all, we need to get the superintendent involved in this and the board president, but no, he can't do that. It's not permitted. But that was an example, and admittedly an extreme example that is the stuff of storytelling only because it's so extreme. But it illustrates the point. Here's an individual who thinks I'm on the school board and therefore I'm the boss. I can go out and take notes on how people are doing their job. Nothing could be further from the truth, of course. You know, obviously that was somewhat unethical as well as just frankly, you know, terrorizing for the individuals that worked in that office. But all that being said, it does illustrate the point. Individual board members, you're citizens, you're part of a collective, and you have only the authority of the body when the body acts as a collective or as is delegated to you by that body. If that school board would have gotten together and had taken a vote saying we want to send John Doe over to the high school to take notes, this might be a practice that the human resources director would make every attempt to stop, but it would at least then have the board authority. In the absence of that, no such thing is permitted. So again, you're a collective body that works together and acts together. There's so much more there for you to read and so much to ask questions about, but that's kind of the high notes I wanted to cover as part of our discussion this evening. So, Mr. President, I can entertain any questions now or later as you prefer.
I think really what we're moving into, these next two sections are an open conversation. And I think it'll be great to have you so you can join in on that, and then people can ask you questions too directly. But this is wonderful, and I know that this is a training that's available statewide, but this is nice because it's specifically tailored to us and ties in our policies. So thank you for compiling it. It's really helpful, and would encourage all the board members to take the time to read through it all. There's certainly some things, even after 3 years on the board, that I'm not particularly aware of that are in here. So I think it's good to fresh up even if we've been on it for a while. The next section that I wanted us to talk about, which before I was president, the board tried to get working on collectively, was board governance and discussing a board governance model. So I'll draw your attention to the school book handbook, the school board handbook. Pages 5 through 15 are really those are really our areas that get into school board responsibilities and duties as well as board governance. So you'll see on pages 6 and 7 two different governance models, and they're both here on purpose. One, the key works of school boards, was formally adopted by the school board several years ago. I'm not sure if any of the board members who were there to adopt it are still on the board, except, were you both on it, Charles and? Okay. Okay. So that must have been like 2013, I'm thinking? 13 or, yeah, okay. So 5 years ago. So 2 of the 7 were part of that process. Since that time, we've certainly talked about key works of school boards. We've also talked about the coherent governance model. There was a book study that the school board had, I think about a year ago, which got more into the coherent governance model. Yep, that one. Yeah, I think Boards That Work is the title of it, or something like that. Boards That Matter. We all matter. So these are really the 2 governance models that we've looked at as a board. Going beyond that, looking at page 8 through 15, these are really all the policies that we have to really self-police our governance as a school board. Some of them Kirk mentioned in his presentation, everything from new orientation of members, our role, our self-evaluation to hold ourselves accountable, the code of conduct, member guidelines, disciplining of board members. So those are all pieces that really get at the nuts and bolts of our governance as a board. So along with reading through this lovely packet from Kirk, if you could read through pages 5 through 15 after the meeting today, that would be helpful. And I know some of you have already, but this may be a new handbook to some of you. And actually, on the back of this handbook, the last sheet is a little sheet for your signature, just identifying that you have received the handbook, understand its contents, and agree with it. So whenever you've had time to read through the handbook, it'd be great if you could just sign that and bring it into the superintendent's office. Then we know that we're all on the same page regarding these responsibilities and duties as board members, holding ourselves to that high standard. But I wanted to talk a little bit about next steps for board governance, because we've talked a lot about board governance, what we want to do, what we don't want to do, and I think that there are still a lot of questions. Obviously, we have board members with tenure anywhere from 5 years to 5 months, and so there is, I think, there's varied levels of awareness and understanding, but also I think that there are some new perspectives that are perhaps helpful to us as a board that can help question our process in the past and see other areas for improvement. So what we'd like to do is create a workflow document, which would, I think we'd probably have access, I would have access, and Dr. Harbeck would have access, and what we would mainly have it for is any board member that had questions about board operations or board governance, things that are on their mind right now that they would like to see perhaps fleshed out or even better addressed with a governance model specifically, to put those in that document. And then what we would like to have happen is to have a facilitator come speak to the board within the next several months. One representing key works of school boards, and one representing coherent governance, so that we as a board can engage in some professional development regarding those two governance models, and giving them beforehand that workflow document so they can see kind of where the board members are at as far as questions and areas for clarification. And then hopefully coming out of that, the ultimate goal would be that through hearing those presentations and then potentially 1 or 2 work sessions, we'd be able to, as a school board, our current school board, be able to adopt a governance model for ourselves. And if that's simply a reaffirmation of KeyWorks, that's fine. Or if that's moving towards coherent governance, that's fine. Obviously, there are other governance models out there, but those are the 2 that we've really looked at thus far as board members. But that's kind of where I'll leave it off. Those are my initial thoughts, developing that workflow for board member feedback in the short term, and then looking over the next several months to get facilitators from each of those key camps to come and speak with us. But I'd open it up to any questions or ideas that you have to help flesh out the process. Yeah.
Yeah,
Turn your microphone on, though, because we have...
okay. I'm sorry. I think that's a great idea. When I look back at the time we spent on KeyWorks, which we all just really, it really sets a tone for a school board and provides you lots of higher level questions and things that boards really need to look at. And then as we went through coherent governance, for us, I can remember it provided us more specificity of process. And I think we looked at that specificity because we had so many people on and off the board at the time, in the sense of having more structure. And so it would be nice to go back again and look at them to see how that could serve us in that way. I always looked at us as possibly adopting something that was a blend of both, but maybe not.
Yeah, I think, the board has talked about it. Obviously, I think the last time the board talked about it, there were at least 1 or 2 or maybe 3 different board members. It's been a while. So kind of how I felt is, yes, we need to get back into this work, but we need perhaps a little bit more professional development first and talking to the experts and hearing from them. I think that having the governance workflow where folks can add their questions or just areas they'd like to talk about can help provide a background for those facilitators. And when I talk about the kind of questions to put out there, they don't have to be super lofty. They can be as simple as what does the process of developing a budget look like in this governance model? What does the process of writing policy look like? What is the board's role in day-to-day matters in this governance model? So just looking at what logistically is our role as board members and then in partnership with our executive team. And I think that in having those questions, and I would hope that, I'll put a document together and share it out in the next couple days, and I would hope that you can just read through the handbook, read through this, and put some in there, and I think it would help maximize our time with the presenters. They can get a really good sense of where we're coming from. But yeah, and then looking to adopt something formally as a board. It's been kind of, I feel in an uncomfortable position. We obviously have policies that govern us, but they're definitely potpourri of policies. There isn't one unified way that we as a board do our work. And so having a governance model that we have owned and can continue to own, I think would be great to hold ourselves all of that high standard and be as efficient as possible in our workings with the administration. So I guess, is there anything that you would like to add, Kirk? Kind of your perspective on this. I know you work with a lot of school districts, and many of them have looked at the various governance models. Do you have suggestions for us? Do you feel like these would be good next steps, or what's your take on it?
I'm sorry, I have to get used to touching the button. First of all, I like the idea of considering scholarship in the area and competing points of view. I mean, I think it's important for you to find your own synthesis. So that's a good way of approaching it. I think the other thing is in finding that synthesis, trying to define what your processes will be for the board in relation to its committees. And I think that one of the things that we often see with school boards is we have a committee system, but the interrelationship between the committee and the board is, the committees and the board is something that has been, has not been evaluated and has not been discussed as much as perhaps it should be. And we run into snags in a number of areas when we try to determine how the committees should be working with the board when we do it on the fly. And so having some understanding, not so much a rule-oriented understanding, because again, if you have rules with too rigid edges, you can't make exceptions when you need to. But I think it's important to at least have some guidelines and protocols on how you want to approach that, so that way your committees are functional rather than an impediment to your process or alternative forums where you get wildly different results depending on how you approach the committee-board relationship. So that's kind of a first thing. The other thing that comes to mind is it really isn't any different when you're looking at how the board interacts with administration and how the board defines what administrative roles are. Obviously, you have highly skilled professionals working for you at the administrative level. How do you maximize the value of administration and reflect how the board values the management of the district? Because, of course, most boards are going to say, we want to be the superintending, no pun intended, authority for the school district, but we don't want to manage the place. We want to make sure that we are delegating that appropriately to our management. And when we do that, observing a certain guidelines to respect that process, because obviously it's one thing to do it in word, it's another to do it in deed. And I think defining, again, with some rounded corners so that you can make exceptions in appropriate cases, but defining your general philosophy about how you interact with administration and how you're going to observe distinctions between board function and management functions that your administration accomplishes.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good segue, because you're talking about, and I agree that a key piece of whatever our governance model looks like is how it helps specify and define our committee functions as a school district. Before we, and that's our next piece, do board members have any suggestions, though, as far as the governance piece? So what I'm proposing is that we do a governance workflow for board members to send in that feedback, and then look probably early winter to invite the speakers once we've been able to work through our budget process, and then have that be how we go forward with it. Would that be okay to folks? Are there any additions to that process people want to? Yeah.
Before the speakers arrive, just having the background reading.
Yeah.
So that we can enter into it at more than just the, starting level.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because I think that if we could do potentially a little short book study of each of the models. I know we did that in the past, so we could reorder some copies and do that again. Okay, so we have some concrete things that we can do moving forward on that front. I want to move over on then to the review of Policy 185 and just a discussion about committees. It's a good segue to it. So this policy has been revised just in my time on the board 3 different times, and I think that that's a pretty good indicator that we've had emerging and kind of evolving discussions and viewpoints about what the role of committees are in our district, when more specifically, what are our roles on committees that perhaps we're not as in tune with, that maybe are not standing committees, more of an ad hoc nature. So there's 3 key areas that I outline in this agenda that I think would be good to talk through as it pertains to Policy 185. And then it'll obviously be open if there are others that folks want to talk through. The first was a question regarding an ad hoc committee role. And it's on the back side of this policy. It really gets into the ad hoc committees. And then also, what I probably could add to this agenda, clarification regarding the ex officio role. So we obviously have board members who serve ex officio on a number of committees. We had many more committees that board members served ex officio on, and the last time that we updated this in June, the decision was made to take a lot of board members off and kind of have board member attendance on a rotating basis and step it back a little bit. So far, I haven't really heard feedback either way on that from the committees. I think that perhaps one positive outcome of that can be that we have perhaps more board member faces at these meetings. They're perhaps able to get acquainted with more than just one board member for a year's time of work, and it could also, I think, help with preventing board members having undue influence on some of those committees by always being the one person who's there to speak for the board. So the current ex officio membership, I know that board members who sit on these do not vote, and on some of these committees, the board members have engaged in conversation, and I've also heard that in some they have not. So I think it will be interesting to talk through that, and I understand they're all kind of a different nature. There's a big difference between the Head Start Committee versus a charter school governance board or the foundation board. But I don't know, maybe Kirk, if you could talk us through being an ex officio member, what are the rights and responsibilities?
Different boards use the term ex officio differently. Yeah. In your board, how are you using the term?
Non-voting member.
Okay. But you still attend the committee meeting as a voting member, and
as a speaking member.
As a speaking member, and will that result in a majority of the board being part of that committee?
No.
Okay. So an ex officio member might be the third person on a committee of two, for example.
Well, I guess the way that we've currently formulated it is an ex officio member is the one board representative that we will send to an external committee.
To an external
That is
committee.
not a standing committee of our district, more like we have, for example, and this is due to our contracts, but on the two charter school governance
Oh,
boards,
sure.
we have one board member that we send as our ex officio, so they're non-voting, but they're there to ideally report back to the board.
Okay.
And be kind of that liaison.
Yeah, well, in that event, first of all, I think it's good to do, but you have to regulate it very carefully.
Yeah.
One of the things you want to make sure is that that individual is not only not a voting member, but unless they are dispatched by the board with a specific message or a specific communique, they have to be careful not to speak for the board and not to represent that they can deliver some sort of outcome for the board if in point of fact the board has not considered it. So I think it's a good practice to keep the board in touch with others. I think it's important for you to have board member involvement in other committees, bodies, boards, civic and otherwise, frankly. But the key being to make sure that the individual is not involved in making representations on the behalf of the board that they don't have the authority to make. And I think also, if the body that they are meeting with has somehow also been organized by the board, and we see that in a number of cases where we will have a blue ribbon panel that has been put together to study curriculum issues. An example that came up in my practice in the last couple of years is we had a committee that was put together to study reading test scores and to make recommendations in the curriculum about reading. The committee was comprised of, I think, 2 teachers, 2 administrators, 3 citizens, and 1 board member. But it was created by the board and it was given certain board authorities to act. In that situation, the other thing I would mention is we will have times when these groups that work as a collective body end up being covered by the open meetings law because of the fact that they were created by the board and authorized to exercise some authority that falls within the powers or duties of the Board of Education by statute. So we can literally have the open meeting law applied to a body that doesn't have any elected officials on it, or maybe just one. So if we're talking about that kind of body, that's the other thing that I would bear in mind, is to be cautious about our open meetings law obligations in posting those meetings as well.
Yeah. Do you think there would be a benefit in adding some specificity to the ex officio limitations to the policy itself?
Yes.
Okay. So I think we can do that right in that section. So the kind of the clarification, the major clarifications, of course, not a voting member and does not speak for the board. Doesn't mean they cannot speak at the meeting, but really having that clarification that when they're there, they're not an agent of the school board. They're there, they're the representative that we have going there, but they're not our collective voice at it.
Right.
So does that I know we've had a couple board members ask about that, the ex officio piece. Does that provide sufficient clarity, or are there other questions people have with that? Yeah.
I wonder what is the real purpose then to have this advisory committee. It would be a situation where you send a board to a meeting and not being able to be productive in assisting the committee members. In other words, a committee member in that committee might be asking, what is the board position on this? And what do you do? How do you function in that capacity?
And others can chime in too if they have thoughts on it. I guess the question of if a committee asks, if say, for example, sitting in the McKinley Charter School Governance Board, and they ask, what would the board consider doing with this kind of a policy, XYZ, that would impact our school? I think that's precisely why we have someone there. But then it's incumbent upon that person to say, great question, I'll take it to the board and get back. And so they're kind of, in that sense, they're serving as a liaison for the board. And they're not automatically going to speak for the board. We don't want to put anyone in that position, but they can serve as that liaison person.
If I may, it's the same as being on a regular committee in that respect. I mean, it happens in the budget committee, for example. We just know how to handle it. It's not really a question. You don't get asked the question, what does the board think in that situation? But it's the same process, basically. Oh, we have a question for the board. Okay, let's get it to the board. But there may be I guess the difference is there's a recommendation aspect that often comes out of, for example, budget development. I guess maybe wouldn't play as much of a role in an ex officio type capacity where we're trying collectively as a committee to come up with recommendations, for example. Is that?
Well, there are two issues that I can see here. So the board member come back, where in the board meeting that person communicate with the rest of the board and get back to the committee. That's concern number one. Concern number two, whatever you say in that meeting, it has a tone for the committee. And that committee's decision will be impaired of your being there and say something. Is that the intent? I think not.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right that we have to be really careful about that. And that's kind of where I think the self-regulation has to come into play, but also if we could be more specific in the policy about this is specifically what an ex officio member does. Your question about what's the mechanism for bringing back to the board, in the past we used to have committee reports from if a board member, say for example, I remember when I don't remember who it was that was on the McKinley Governance Board. Was it Catherine? Yeah, so when Commissioner Duax present at the board meeting, sometimes if there was something going on, she'd share it at the committee report time. Or she would bring it to agenda setting. So I think those are two places, or at the end of the meeting for requests for future agenda items. Those are three ways that it could be brought direct to the board. But I think more often than not, because the superintendent isn't always at those meetings, or the exec team isn't always at those meetings. So if there's a question that's brought, perhaps it's good to go to those folks first before having to come to the board. Maybe it's an administrative issue that could be dealt with. But I think it's just having you there to serve as a liaison, to bring back those concerns, to bring back ideas. And it does kind of come to the committee member discretion and the ability to do those things. But if we provided more clarification in the policy, would that be helpful? Or what, in your mind, Charles, what would be a fix or a way to provide some more detail to this?
The only role I can see is just a PR, the publicity. Otherwise, eliminate this committee completely.
Well, yeah, and I get that. I think that where the position that we're in right now is all of the current ex officio places where we have a board member, of which it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5 places that we have an ex officio. They're all required by something. So in the case of the 2 charter schools, we have to have someone there because of the charter between that school and the board. With the wellness committee, that's USDA, and then with Head Start, that's federal, and then with the Public Schools Foundation, that's in their bylaws. So I get what you're saying. I think we're kind of in a place where we need to have ex officio members. That's just a requirement right now. So it's how do we maximize what that looks like? And do we need to provide specificity or professional development or whatever so that folks know exactly why am I here and know why am I not here, you know? But I think we could work in policy and governance on some clarifying language as to what exactly that role looks like and what it doesn't look like. And that could at least be a good start. You know, I think the bottom line is we have to have the ex officio on these 5. These are the, we took away the ex officio from all the other ones. We're simply just required to have them on these. So how do we at least make it worthwhile to have those folks there? You know. Yeah. It's kind of an interest. Yeah, we haven't really talked through it as a board. We haven't talked through what does an ex officio member do actually. So I think having this conversation can be healthy, and then hopefully we can just clarify it in the policy. Is there anything else regarding that ex officio piece? Because my takeaway is that we'll just work on adding some language to that, clean it up, make it pretty clear what Charles is talking about, so we can maybe prevent some issues from occurring. The other piece that I wanted to make sure we covered was board members attending a committee meeting that they are not a member of. So obviously we're all board members, but attending, for example, if I only serve on the Policy and Governance Committee, that's the one committee I'm on in the district. But if I attend the Budget Development Committee or opt to attend the LEAP Committee or whatever, and so I don't know, maybe Kirk, you could, I'm sure that you've seen this in other districts potentially as a question or maybe even an issue that's popped up. We currently have in our policy that board members may attend and participate in a discussion that occurs. However, they will not have the authority to make motions and vote. But we also say there, except to the extent that the board takes official action establishing a contrary rule or directive, whatever that meant. So maybe you could help us with this and just talk through it.
Yeah,
and we're very good on time, so.
Okay. Well, first of all, I should mention there is in state law a provision that allows a school board to say, we're not going to have board members attend meetings of committees that they are not a member of. So a school board does have the option of passing a rule that restricts non-committee members from attending those meetings. I am not, frankly, somebody who is particularly supportive of adopting those policies. I think of them as kind of the final step one takes if other things don't work in order to make sure that the committee system runs smoothly. So that is available, but I see that as something that's a matter of last resort. Before anyone gets to that point, I think that the most important factors that we see that can cause trouble when they're handled wrongly, and they're frankly helpful when handled rightly, is first of all the physical makeup of the room. One of the things that's very important to do is make it absolutely clear that the board members who are not on the committee are not sitting with the committee, that they are not participating in the meeting in a way that your average citizen can't or won't. And we see both of those types of problems from time to time where board members will actually take a seat up kind of near the rest of the members of the committee, and anybody who's come to watch the meeting and take in the meeting sits kind of in front of the meeting. I think it's important to physically make clear that when a board member not on the committee attends a meeting, that they are, again, a private citizen and nothing more, and they attend by sitting where the other citizens do. The same is true of the dialogue. That board member has no special privilege for participation in the meeting that your average citizen doesn't. So they don't enjoy a special privilege to be recognized by the chair. If they are not recognized by the chair, they should not have a privileged position to address the committee. Everything we do physically, in thought, word, and deed should be dedicated to making clear that separation, that an individual is there as an observer. All that being said, we still have to make sure our committee meeting notices tell the public that we may have other board members attend, and because we may have other board members attend, we may end up having a majority of the board at a committee meeting. When that happens, we use the disclaimers that we ordinarily put in our notices to make clear to the public that those individuals are not participants in the committee or voting members. They're attending as members of the public, and that is it. So we want to make sure that physically, in terms of the rights of the board member at the meeting, and in terms of how we structure that through language, that it is always very clear that this is the committee and these are the citizens attending the meeting, and that may include board members.
Okay. So is this another area, Kirk, that, so we have that section here, it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th section down under board committees overview on the other side. I don't know if you have a copy of the policy in front of you or not.
It's quite, Joe, it's quite stated too in the handbook, under 185, page 11.
Oh, what's on?
Just the specificity of it, if we want to change it.
Oh, yeah. Well, if we change the policy, I think the handbook automatically changes, right? I think. So I'm wondering, is this an area, Kirk, where you feel we should be more specific? Or I guess I should give you a minute to see it, read it.
Well, I have read it.
Okay.
Yes, I think more specificity is in order, and I also think there are some things that we would ordinarily encourage you to simply change, where it's not a matter of being not specific enough, that it just is pointed, I think, in the wrong direction.
In the specific part about board members attending?
Yeah, and surrounding that language, yes.
Okay. I guess, yeah, for me, I feel like it's a policy issue, and it's also a cultural issue within the board, because I want to make sure that, like, if, for example, when we had Policy and Governance Committee meeting working on the school resource officer policy, I remember Commissioner Bika had some suggestions, and so she was invited for that specific agenda item to speak to that and provide feedback and be in the discussion. So I think something like that is helpful and healthy, and it's a publicly noticed meeting anyways, so it didn't make any, there was no difference there by having her join. But that was also planned, and it was, everyone was aware going into it. So, and that's the only example I can really think of from committees I've been on. But, so I know it can work, and it's a valuable way that if there's a specific topic that a board member wishes to speak to in a different committee they're not on, I think it's helpful. But I think where it could break down is if it's just happening without the chairperson knowing, or if it's just happening, like, I know what you're talking about, Kirk, not necessarily, you've seen it in the past where they will show up at a committee meeting, they'll potentially speak when the public speaks, or they'll speak to a specific issue as a guest of the committee, but not necessarily just attending the whole meeting as basically in an ex officio capacity. Correct? Okay. So that's where I see we could maybe clarify what we're talking about here, and make sure that everyone's on the same page, and put maybe some more specificity there.
Yeah, because I think right now what you have is the culture, whatever that culture may be, has to be driving the answers, because there isn't language guiding any of that.
Yeah. Do any board? Yep. Commissioner Whitfield.
I think to make it more specific too would be best, because I had this experience, and I think that if we would have had more of a guideline relative to the policy, it would have been helpful. I want to speak a little bit too, though, to committee transitions of membership during the reorganization. Could we look a little bit too at that? with more, culturally as well, so that we're not assuming certain things about each other as far as, trying to be helpful or provide information. Maybe if that's spelled out a little bit more, things, there won't be any assumptions too, which is good for any organization
Yeah, I think that's a
and
good
good for
point.
everybody.
Yeah. Well, I think particularly with the lack of incumbency that we
Yeah.
have now as a board
Yeah.
on our committees.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that would have been helpful for me.
Yeah. Okay. The other piece that I just wanted to talk through, and if others have anything, please chime in. Because so far we have with this section, with policy 185, is to add some language to the ex officio section, and then to add some language to the section about board members attending with some more clarity, and we can work with you on both of those, I would think. And the third I want to talk through is, with policy 185, is members on our committees in the district. So currently, there's nothing that sets any sort of term limit on our committees. And I know, for example, because I've served on committees for the city and county, and it's like a 3-year term usually is the norm with city and county commissions or whatever. And I think that's your term on the board of the housing commission, right? Oh, it's 5. Okay, well.
But there's always a term limit.
Yeah, yeah. So I think mine, which is the city, I'm on the utilities committee. It's, I think, a 3-year term. We've met once. It's a great committee. The best kind of committee. But, so I think that we definitely should to talk through that, having some sort of term limits in place, particularly with citizen members, because I think that you need to have fresh faces, and you need to be able to have a good mix of incumbency and new folks. So and these are all things that I'll ask our P&G committee chair. We can work on them in that committee. But the piece about the term limits, I'm wondering, Kirk, is like a 3-year term? What, I mean, have you seen boards setting? I'm assuming you have, because it's pretty much a norm that local governments have term limits with these appointments. But what kind of numbers have you seen?
Candidly, everything from soup to nuts.
That's
This
not
is
helpful.
something, yeah, it really,
Okay.
if you're looking for a consensus result born of what everybody is doing in Wisconsin, you're not going to
No.
find it. There's just a lot of variation in practices. Many don't have those limits, and those that do, frankly, have quite different limits depending usually on the nature of the board. Some boards experience regular turnover. Some boards have long-standing members where these things are not an issue, and if they had term limits,
Yeah.
it'd be impractical for how that board has historically functioned. And so, from my perspective, you're not going to see any one way of doing this that enjoys consensus among school boards across the state. There's really just tailoring to fit the circumstances of the board.
Okay. I mean, what comes to mind for me is 3, just because I think with most of the commissions and committees with city and county, it's 3. And also, our terms are 3 years.
Right.
So if we have 3-year terms, I think that's probably okay with the committees too. But I don't know, what are other folks' takes on it? Any ideas, opinions? Oh, yep, go ahead.
Just drawing in an example from sort of some of the more private, less public boards that I sit on that still have that flair. Often what they will do is set a 3-year term, but then set a second 3-year term that's sort of, well, let's see how this first 3 years goes, and then we'll see if we're going to ask you for the second one. So it's more of a consensus. So it works both ways too. It's, yes, we've got a great board member that we want to keep, but it's also for that board member to say, you know what, 3 years was plenty, and now I don't want to be on that second term. So that seems to be setting those 2 successive terms seems to be a good way for both sides to kind of address that.
Yeah, I like that. So they may serve 2 3-year terms. Is it And from what you've seen, is it pretty much always consecutively, or could it be non-consecutively?
I've never seen it non-consecutively, but I don't know why.
Yeah. Okay. That's good.
I think it would be hard to serve 3 years, be off for a while, and pick up again
Yeah,
and serve
yeah.
another 3.
Okay, that's helpful. So we can add that. Is there anything else with this policy that folks are, I see you looking at Robert's rules. Is there anything good in there? Anything to help us? Well, yeah.
It's just about ex officio.
Oh, okay.
I mean, for parliamentarians, non-voting is not the definition of ex officio. An ex officio member has exactly the same rights and privileges as all other members, including, of course, the right to vote. So that's something that we should, we'll have to talk more about.
Clarifying the policy. Would board members want to just change it to be called non-voting member? Or,
I think that
yeah,
probably should have a little discussion about.
yeah. Well, and we should look and see
I
specific.
Googled it earlier. It means you're there because you hold a certain office.
Right.
It's well, just Latin.
By virtue of the
By
position
virtue of your
school
office,
board
that's
member.
why you're on the committee.
Right.
So, doesn't necessarily mean non-voting or anything. other
Yeah,
than that.
right. I think, yeah, you're right. It's been more of a cultural thing for our board. That's what it's become, but I think that we just need to make that so much more clear in the policy, I think. But that's good to, what page was that on?
113 to 114.
We will consult that. Thank you. So, employees watching us, if you ever complain about your professional development, you have to do, we're doing our professional development. So this is our PD. Okay, well, are there any other, we have some good takeaways with each of these areas, with policy 185 and then with the board governance piece. Is there anything else with either of those that board members have on their mind or would like to talk about tonight? Okay. Oh,
I just want to say something that we have been doing, though, that I would like to give us credit for as a board, since we had all those discussions about governance, is our workflow for the board, and that the yearly workflow has really been very well added to and gives us a good picture. And do we have that online yet? The workflow?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for us, yeah, okay.
mhm.
But is it online for the public?
No.
Okay.
I don't think it is.
Okay, and we did discuss that because that is really the work of the board, so I don't know, just throwing that out there. I think we've done well with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and that was just one page from that book, so just think if
It
we
went
could-
from board at a glance, which I have a really hard time not calling it, to the workflow of the board.
Yeah,
That came out of the coherence government.
Coherent
right? And
governance,
it's
yeah.
kind of this idea of we're going to step back, we're going to kind of design the machine, and then step back and let the machine run for a year and sort of check how it did at the end of the year. That's an exaggeration, but that's sort of
Right.
by contrast compared to, say, like a Keyworks.
Keyworks.
And the only other thing that we brought up that we might have started doing that we didn't discuss again was, should the board move to adopt the agenda at every meeting? Because we had that discussion as too. That may be the first thing we discuss if we want to do that, because that's something a lot of boards do and we don't, so.
Okay, well, we're going to finish ahead of schedule, so I'll just do a quick overview of what we went through tonight, so we're all on the same page. So with the board responsibilities piece, if you could all just read through on your own time Kirk's booklet, it's very helpful. On the board governance piece, if you could read through the handbook and sign it and bring it to the superintendent's office. And on that front, we'll have a board governance workflow going live in the next couple days. And we'll work on getting copies of the 2 booklets to every board member in case not every board member has them. We probably have extras in the office. And then we'll work on inviting presenters from both governance models to speak to the board in early winter. And then on the board policy 185 piece, we'll look to add language to the ex officio section, board members attending other meetings section, and something about term limits. So that's what we did. We covered a lot of ground, so good. Anything else board members have tonight? Okay. Then, thank you very much for coming, Kirk. Appreciate it. Always good to see you. And I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Unless
So
you want to
moved.
stay, I mean, okay.
Second.
Second, okay. All in favor? Aye. We're adjourned.
This program was brought to you by a cooperation between Newsworks and the Eau Claire Area School Board. Newsworks is made possible by continuing community support. If you would like to volunteer or make a donation, please contact us via phone at 715-839-5067 or online at valleymediaworks.org.